The night was heavy with silence, the kind that presses down on the chest until every breath feels like defiance against fear itself, and the platoon crouched low in the darkness, just beyond the clearing they had christened the kill zone. No one said the words out loud, but everyone knew what it was. A strip of open ground exposed under the moonlight, crisscrossed with enemy fire lanes, likely mined, watched through scopes of rifles hidden in the black line of trees on the far side. The mission demanded they cross it. Their orders were clear, the objective lay beyond that stretch of deadly emptiness, and yet their boots stayed dug into the dirt where safety still lingered like a fragile gift. Men who had marched through storms of bullets and fire before now froze in the face of this place, because something about it felt final. It was not just another battlefield hazard, it was a silent dare from death itself, and the team felt the weight of that dare in their bones. They looked at each other in the dark, eyes flashing with the question none wanted to voice: who among us will step first? The leader tried to summon courage in his men with low whispers, reminding them of training, of duty, of the brothers who depended on them beyond the line, but even he could not bring himself to move. Every second stretched like an eternity, the cold ground biting at their knees, their lungs filling with the metallic taste of fear that they would never admit out loud. In that thick pause, every heartbeat sounded like betrayal, a rhythm too loud as if the enemy could hear them quaking from across the clearing. Each man clutched his weapon tighter, knuckles pale under the dim light, and in that silent refusal their humanity was bare. Brave, trained, hardened, but still men, not machines, and men do not walk eagerly into the mouth of certain death. Then, without ceremony, without order, without even a whisper of warning, she rose. Her name had not carried weight before this night. She had been one among many, trained like the rest, respected but not legendary, a quiet presence in the unit who did her work without complaint and never sought attention. Yet in the moment when the silence had turned into a prison none could break, she became the fracture in its walls. Slowly, deliberately she stood to her full height, the moonlight sliding across her helmet, her rifle gripped steady, and though every pair of eyes turned to her in shock, none dared to call her back down. Her breath steadied, the way one breathes before stepping into freezing water, and then she took the first step forward, into the pale glow of the clearing, into the space everyone had decided was untouchable. For an instant the universe itself seemed to hold its breath. The grass shifted under her boots, the air felt sharp enough to cut skin, and still no shot came. Her teammates, crouched in disbelief, felt a crack open in the shell of their fear, the first impossible possibility that maybe the kill zone was not invincible, that maybe courage was not as mythical as it had seemed a moment before. She did not look back at them, her eyes fixed on the tree line beyond, on the destination that had seemed unreachable seconds ago. Her second step echoed louder than gunfire in the ears of those who watched, not because of sound but because of what it meant. The barrier had been broken, the impossible had been dared. Still no bullet came. Every man behind her felt the weight of shame and pride twisting together inside him, ashamed that they had not moved, proud that someone among them had carried their honor forward. She kept walking, her silhouette stark and defiant against the pale glow, and with each pace she took, something within the others began to break loose, as if her courage had ignited a spark that leapt from one soul to another, demanding to be answered. When she reached the middle of the clearing, the kill zone's heart, time itself seemed to shudder, as if the world was deciding whether to crush her or let her pass. She walked with the dignity of someone who had already accepted whatever end might come, and that acceptance was more powerful than fear itself. Then, with the same suddenness that her first step had cut the silence, another figure rose from the dirt behind her, and then another and another, until the line of hesitation shattered and the team surged to their feet. They did not shout, they did not call out her name, but their boots struck the ground in unison with hers, and the kill zone that had seemed like death's private domain became a path carved by courage. Together they moved, no longer individuals trapped in terror, but a unit carried by the rhythm she had begun. If death waited for them in the trees ahead, they would meet it not as statues carved in fear but as warriors in motion, and it all began with the single moment she had chosen to believe that steps could still be taken. That first step had been small, only inches of ground covered, but in truth it was a chasm crossed, a defiance of despair itself, and though they had yet to reach the other side, they knew already that their story had changed. She had led them not by command, not by rank, but by the sheer audacity to move when no one else dared, and in that audacity the team remembered who they were meant to be. The forest beyond the clearing loomed like the open jaws of a predator, and though every instinct screamed at them to halt, to cling to the relative safety they had left behind, their legs carried them forward because she had shown them it was possible. The kill zone faded behind them step by step, yet the danger only deepened ahead. Each boot sank into soil damp with recent rain, the air filled with the mingled scent of pine and rot, and somewhere in that darkness they knew eyes were watching. The enemy had carved these woods into a labyrinth of death, threading snares and tripwires between roots, concealing sharpshooters behind trunks, planting charges where careless feet would wander. Every soldier in the squad had studied maps, rehearsed maneuvers, drilled until muscle memory blurred with instinct, but in the suffocating closeness of the trees all of that training felt distant, abstract, compared to the raw truth of the moment. They were alive only as long as courage held its fragile flame. She led with steps that did not falter, her silhouette dissolving into shadow yet always distinct enough that the others could fix their eyes on her back and remember why they had moved. Fear still rode in their veins, a constant drumbeat under the skin, but now it was a companion instead of a master. Each man found his breath sinking with hers, shorter and sharper when the ground shifted, steadier when the way ahead appeared clear, and in that rhythm they began to understand that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to act while fear clawed at the edges of reason. The forest grew thicker, branches clawing at their gear, twigs snapping beneath boots like gunshots, and each sound seemed amplified in the quiet, yet no ambush erupted. It was as if the enemy was waiting, letting them draw deeper into the snare, confident that no group of mortals could survive what lay further ahead. Their hearts knew this truth, but something else had taken root since she had stepped into the kill zone. Defiance, the stubborn belief that fate could be rewritten by will alone. Every glance exchanged between them carried that fire, silent vows to follow her as long as breath remained. The leader, once paralyzed at the edge of the clearing, now walked a pace behind her. Shame and gratitude wrestling inside him, aware that in the eyes of his men command had quietly shifted, that respect had migrated to the one who had dared what he had not. Yet he did not resent it. Instead, he guarded her flank with an unspoken oath that if death came, it would not take her without meeting his defiance too. Step by step they pressed on, each man battling his own ghosts, memories of comrades lost in places not so different from this, doubts whispering that the forest would claim them in silence as it had claimed so many before. But each time despair threatened to slow a stride, the sight of her shoulders moving forward cut through the fog like a blade. She seemed untouchable, not because she was immune to fear but because she wore it without shame, moving as though the weight of dread was something she had long ago learned to carry. The minutes stretched into an eternity as they advanced, but the further they went, the more the impossible seemed to bend. Perhaps the kill zone had been the true test, perhaps the worst of the enemy's cruelty was behind them, or perhaps the storm was only gathering. They did not know. All they knew was that the air was growing colder, the forest darker, and the silence heavier. It was in that silence that the first shot finally cracked. The sound tore through the night like lightning, splintering the stillness, and the squad dropped instinctively, weapons raised, eyes scanning shadows. The bullet had not struck her, though it had sung past close enough to graze bark just inches from her head. She did not stop. She did not duck. She raised her rifle and sighted into the darkness with calm hands, her voice cutting through the chaos with two words: keep moving. The command was not shouted but carried with such certainty that it rang louder than the gunfire erupting around them. The squad obeyed, rising into motion even as bullets sparked through branches, even as soil erupted at their feet. They ran, weaving between trunks, returning fire when shadows flickered, driven not by survival alone but by the refusal to dishonor the courage she embodied. She moved like a phantom ahead of them, each motion efficient, precise, and though danger surrounded them, no bullet found her, as if even death hesitated before her resolve. One man stumbled as a round tore through his shoulder, collapsing with a cry that split the night, but before despair could seize the team, she was already there, hauling him up with strength that belied her frame, dragging him forward while firing bursts that forced the enemy to recoil deeper into their cover. In that act, she carved the second truth into her comrades' hearts. She would not abandon them, not a single one, and so long as she moved they too could endure. Blood darkened his uniform, but he kept running, teeth clenched, because she had not let him fall behind. The firefight stretched on, minutes blending into a storm of flashes and thunder, yet the team pressed deeper, their fear transmuted into fury, into defiance. By the time silence reclaimed the forest, bodies lay hidden in shadows, smoke lingered in the branches, and the squad was still on their feet. They paused only long enough to breathe, to reload, to press blood-soaked cloth against wounds, and then her voice again: forward. It was not a plea. It was not a suggestion. It was destiny-given sound, and none resisted. Forward they went, deeper into enemy ground, every step now more than survival, every step a testament that the night would not swallow them quietly. Behind them the kill zone still waited, a graveyard of hesitation, but ahead the path burned with the fire she had lit, a fire that no bullet, no shadow, no fear could extinguish. The deeper they pushed into the woods, the more the night seemed alive with whispers, as if the branches themselves conspired to test their resolve, creaking and groaning like old bones under invisible weight. And yet no one faltered because her shadow moved ahead of them, steady and unshaken, a compass forged not of steel but of courage. The squad followed in a line that twisted through the undergrowth, every bootfall deliberate, every breath controlled, hearts hammering but spirits unwilling to surrender. The injured soldier leaned on a comrade's shoulder, his blood staining the soil behind him, but he refused to stop because she had not let him fall, and if she could walk unharmed into storms of bullets then surely he could bleed his way forward. Their world had narrowed to the crunch of earth beneath boots, the occasional distant crack of gunfire that echoed like thunder too far away to harm them, and the memory of the kill zone that had been left behind, a memory already shifting into legend among them. Each man began to realize that they were no longer walking simply to complete a mission. They were walking because turning back now would mean betraying something sacred, something born the instant she took her first step into danger without hesitation. Fear had once bound them like chains, but now those chains were shards scattered in the dirt, and in their place was an unspoken oath that not one of them would dishonor the courage that carried them. She did not look back often, but when she did her eyes were hard as stone, not because she lacked compassion but because she bore the weight of all of them at once, carrying it in silence so they could keep moving. They began to see her not as the quiet comrade who had always been there but as a symbol, a vessel of defiance that made them believe death itself could be defied if only they chose to rise with her. The forest grew darker, the canopy above sealing away the moon, until their world was painted in shadows and the faint glow of instruments clutched in their hands, but still they pressed on, their senses sharpened to the knife's edge, every rustle and flicker of movement catalogued as a possible threat. When the ground dipped suddenly into a ravine, they halted, the leader lifting his hand for silence, but it was her who stepped forward first to test the slope, sliding halfway down before crouching to scan the bottom. No mines detonated, no ambush erupted, and she signaled them forward. One by one they descended, each careful, until they stood together in the hollow, the air colder, the soil damp, and the silence more suffocating than ever. It was there that doubt tried to creep back in, whispering that perhaps their courage had only carried them into a deeper trap, that perhaps the kill zone had not been the true test but only the gate to something worse. The men exchanged glances, the flicker of unease in their eyes, but before the fear could solidify she raised her weapon and pointed forward, wordlessly commanding them to keep going. Something about the certainty in her posture silenced the doubts. If she believed there was a path through, then there must be. They climbed out of the ravine and entered terrain that grew harsher, brambles tearing at their uniforms, mud clinging to boots, the sound of unseen water rushing somewhere distant. Their breaths grew heavier, lungs aching, but no one complained because complaints felt like betrayal in her presence. She did not ask for devotion, yet it flowed to her naturally, as if every man had decided on his own that she was worth following even if the path led to fire. Then the night itself seemed to turn against them when flares burst suddenly overhead, bathing the forest in a sickly white glow that erased shadows and stripped away their cover. Panic flared in the squad, some dropping instinctively to their stomachs, but she did not flinch. She stood in the open, scanning the trees with calm precision, and then lifted her weapon and fired a single shot into the darkness. A scream answered, sharp and human, and in that sound the squad remembered they were not prey but hunters too. They rose as one, firing into the treeline, their gunfire answering the enemies like thunder answering lightning, and in the chaos she moved first, charging forward under the dying glow of the flare, her pace unbroken. They followed, the forest erupting into fire and smoke, branches splintering, soil churning, but none dared let her vanish into the chaos ahead. She was no longer just a soldier, she was their living oath, and to lose sight of her was to lose sight of themselves. The battle stretched into madness, flashes of muzzle fire painting grotesque shadows across the trunks, men shouting commands and pain alike, grenades sending shockwaves through the ground, yet in every instant she was there, moving, fighting, refusing to yield. The injured man stumbled again, his strength draining, but she turned back once more, gripping his arm and dragging him forward through the smoke, each act of defiance pulling the squad tighter together, binding them with threads stronger than fear. By the time silence returned, the enemy had melted into the trees, leaving behind the reek of gunpowder and blood, and the squad stood heaving in the aftermath, alive against all expectation. They gathered in a circle, weapons ready, scanning the shadows for another attack, but none came. She lowered her rifle then, not in relief but in resolve, her breath ragged but her eyes still unbroken, and with a small gesture of her hand she turned them forward once more. No words were needed. The mission was not finished, and they would see it through because she had made them believe they could. They stepped over the bodies of enemies left in the mud, their boots heavy but their spirits unyielding, and though exhaustion pressed down on them like iron, a fire still burned in their chests. Each man carried wounds, some visible, some buried deep in memory, but all of them carried the same truth now, that the night could not break them so long as they followed the one who had dared the first step. Ahead, the forest grew thicker still, the air colder, the silence heavier, but none hesitated. Where once there had been fear like a weight upon their necks, now there was something else, something stronger, born not of orders or duty but of belief. And belief, they discovered, was heavier than fear, sharper than bullets, more unrelenting than shadows. They followed her deeper into the unknown, their lives no longer their own but bound to hers, and in that surrender they found freedom. The forest began to thin after hours that felt like days, the tangled undergrowth loosening its grip, the oppressive shadows giving way to a faint silver glow ahead, and for the first time the squad glimpsed open sky again through the canopy. The men felt the ache of their bodies more sharply now, every muscle screaming, their throats raw from breathing smoke and cold air, but they kept moving because her figure still led them forward, and to stop while she moved felt impossible. The ground sloped downward into a valley where fog clung thick to the earth, curling around their boots like ghostly fingers, and visibility dropped so low that even the man at arm's length became only a blur. Whispers of unease rose in their minds, the old fears stirring again as the fog swallowed sight and sound alike, but she pressed on without pause, her silhouette cutting through the haze with a certainty that silenced their doubts. The valley air carried a new scent, acrid and metallic, mingled with the faint copper tang of blood that clung to memory as much as to reality, and the squad realized this place was not empty. They crouched lower, scanning the shifting veil around them, nerves stretched taut, and then the first shadow flickered. Figures emerged, faint shapes half hidden in fog, enemy patrols moving with the same cautious tread, and in that instant the valley became a graveyard waiting to be claimed. The squad froze, hearts pounding, every instinct screaming to unleash fire, but before anyone could act she raised her hand, signaling silence. They obeyed, though fear gnawed at their bones, watching as the enemy figures passed dangerously close, unaware of the hunters crouched only steps away. It was a gamble, one that could end in slaughter if even a twig snapped, but her hand remained steady, and that steadiness became theirs. The patrol moved on, swallowed by the fog, leaving only silence behind, and only then did she signal them to advance again. The men exchanged glances filled with disbelief. Disbelief that they had escaped without firing a shot, disbelief that restraint could be more powerful than bullets, disbelief that she had once again chosen the path no one else would have dared. They moved through the fog like ghosts, each step a careful defiance of the valley's hunger, until the ground rose again and the mist thinned. Ahead, through breaks in the vapor, they saw lights flickering, enemy encampment fires burning in the distance, a constellation of danger scattered across the hills beyond. Their mission's heart lay somewhere in that cluster, and the sight struck them with the weight of inevitability. Everything they had endured, every risk taken, every drop of blood spilled had been leading to this. Yet exhaustion now pressed down on them heavier than ever, threatening to turn legs into stone, to break the fragile thread of courage that bound them. She must have felt it too, the drag of fatigue, the ache in her lungs, but when she turned back to them her eyes burned not with despair but with a fire that refused to dim. She whispered then, not loud but clear enough for each man to hear, words that carried more power than any command, "We've come too far to turn back." Those words were not poetry, not strategy, not inspiration crafted for effect. They were truth, spoken raw, and in them the men found their resolve rekindled. They nodded, shoulders squaring, grips tightening on rifles, hearts hardening once more. Together they advanced toward the hills, weaving through the remnants of fog until they reached the first ridgeline. There the enemy awaited, hidden but ready, and the ambush detonated like thunder. Gunfire ripped the night apart, machine guns tearing through the silence, grenades hurling explosions into the earth, and the squad dove for cover, instinct screaming. The hill became a furnace, sparks and smoke and screams colliding in a storm of chaos, but she did not falter. She rose from cover long enough to fire controlled bursts, each shot precise, each motion fearless, and then signaled them to flank left. Without question they followed, crawling through mud and debris, weaving between shattered trees while bullets scorched the air around them. Explosions lit the valley behind, shockwaves slamming into their bodies, but they pressed forward, their courage tethered to her movements like a lifeline. She reached the edge of the enemy line first, crouched behind a shattered log, and lobbed a grenade into a nest of machine gunners. The explosion tore the night, silencing the guns, and in that instant the squad surged with renewed ferocity, charging into the breach she had carved. Steel clashed against flesh, shouts erupted in a language half swallowed by the smoke, and the battle descended into brutal closeness where courage was measured not in strategy but in survival. She fought at the center of it, rifle roaring, blade flashing when the distance closed too tight, moving with a rhythm that seemed almost beyond human, as though the fire inside her had burned away hesitation entirely. Around her, the men fought with a fury that shocked even themselves, because she had proven again and again that fear could be broken, and now they would not allow it back into their veins. The hill became a graveyard of broken bodies and shattered weapons, the ground slick with blood and mud, the air choked with smoke, but by the time silence fell once more it was their squad that still stood. Wounded, battered, half-spent but alive. They gathered in the ruins of the encampment's first line, chest heaving, hands trembling with exhaustion, yet when she lifted her gaze toward the fire still burning further up the hill, they knew without needing to be told, the mission was not yet done. They steadied themselves, tightened their grips on weapons, exchanged nods that carried more weight than words, and once again followed her lead into the rising smoke of the next battle. The climb up the hill was like crawling into the throat of a beast, every step forward heavier than the last, every breath drawn through lungs filled with smoke and dust, yet still they moved because her figure refused to slow. The fires burned brighter above, torches and flames flickering around the enemy's stronghold, shadows moving between the glow as soldiers prepared for another wave. The squad's bodies screamed for rest, their wounds aching, their vision blurred from exhaustion, but their will was bound to her stride, and so long as she walked they could not allow themselves to collapse. The night pulsed with danger, with the certainty of more blood to come, and yet amidst the dread there was also something new, the faint glimmer of inevitability, the feeling that fate itself had begun to bend before them, that death had been cheated too many times tonight to claim them easily now. They crept closer to the next line of defense, weapons ready, nerves taut, eyes scanning every flicker of movement in the firelit dark. The enemy was waiting, of that there was no doubt, but how many, how prepared, none could know. The ground leveled out into a plateau where wooden fortifications had been erected, crude but formidable, and the silhouette of armed men shifted along the barricades. The squad crouched low behind rocks, breaths shallow, listening to the murmur of voices carried on the wind, waiting for the sign to strike. It came not from their commander, nor from the crackle of radios, but from her, as always. She scanned the defenses with eyes sharp despite fatigue, then turned to the men, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, and gave a small nod that said everything, now. They moved like shadows, fanning out along the slope, slipping between patches of darkness until the barricade loomed before them. The first shots rang out when an enemy lookout spotted movement, shouting a warning that was cut short by her rifle's burst. Chaos erupted instantly, flares shot into the sky, the plateau bathed in blinding light, and the defenders opened fire with a storm of bullets. The squad surged forward, driven not by strategy alone but by desperation and the fire she had planted in them, charging the barricade as if hesitation no longer existed in their veins. Grenades arced over the defenses, exploding in thunderous bursts that ripped gaps into the line, and through those gaps they stormed, her at the front, cutting down the stunned defenders with precise bursts. The clash that followed was brutal, close, merciless. Gunfire roared, blades flashed, fists struck when weapons jammed or emptied, and the night became a cacophony of screams and steel. She moved at the center of it all, her rifle rising and falling with unerring rhythm, her voice calling sharp commands when confusion threatened to break them, her presence the unshakable pillar that held the squad upright. One by one the defenders fell, until the plateau ran slick with blood and the barricades burned with fire fed by their own torches. Yet even as silence fell, the squad could not rest, for higher still the hill climbed, and beyond its crest glowed the heart of the enemy encampment, where the true test awaited. They gathered in the aftermath, chests heaving, bodies trembling, wounds bleeding fresh, but none suggested stopping. Their eyes turned to her again, silently asking the question they no longer had to voice. Are we still strong enough to go on? Her answer was not words but movement. She slung her rifle, tightened the straps on her gear, and began the climb anew, her pace steady, her back unbowed, and they followed because to do otherwise was unthinkable. The higher they went, the colder the air grew, the wind cutting sharper against sweat-soaked skin, carrying with it the faint clang of metal and murmur of voices from the camp ahead. Every step was agony, every heartbeat a reminder of how close they had come to the edge of endurance, but every glance at her back reminded them of the promise unspoken, that they would not stop until the mission was done. When they reached the final ridge, the sight before them stole what breath remained. The enemy encampment stretched across the summit, a sprawl of tents and bunkers lit by fire and lantern, soldiers moving in disciplined patrols, weapons stacked in rows, supplies piled high. It was no outpost but a fortress, bristling with force, and for a moment even the fire in their hearts wavered. How could a handful of broken, bloodied men storm such a place and hope to live? Doubt whispered, cruel and insistent, that perhaps their courage had only carried them to the mouth of doom. Yet as the doubt grew heavy, she turned to face them. Her face was gaunt with exhaustion, streaked with grime, eyes shadowed by the weight of the night, and yet those same eyes burned with a light that cut through their despair. She spoke softly, the words barely rising above the wind, but they struck deeper than any battle cry. "We didn't come this far to stop here." That truth pierced them, silenced the whispers, reignited the flame that had nearly guttered out. They tightened their grips on rifles, checked their ammunition, bandaged what wounds they could, and readied themselves for the final storm. The plan was simple because there was no room for complexity. Strike fast, strike hard, and let nothing slow their momentum. She led them down the slope, creeping through shadows toward the outer ring of guards. A sentry turned at the sound of their approach, his eyes widening, but before he could cry out she was upon him, blade flashing once, clean and silent. They slipped past his collapsing form and spread into the camp like wolves, each man striking his target with lethal efficiency. But stealth could not hold long. Shouts erupted as a body was discovered, and within moments the camp exploded into chaos. Fires blazed higher, alarms rang out, and the defenders poured forth like ants from a struck nest. The squad braced for the onslaught, their rifles spitting fire, grenades bursting among clustered enemies, blades flashing when the fight turned close. And at the center, always she fought, tireless despite her wounds, relentless despite her exhaustion, carrying them with her will alone. The camp became a battlefield of fire and smoke, every tent collapsing into flame, every shout drowned in the roar of battle. The squad carved a path through the chaos, each man sustained by the same unbreakable truth: they could not falter so long as she moved. And she never stopped moving. The camp had become a storm of fire and screams, the once ordered stronghold dissolving into chaos as the squad tore through it with a fury born not of numbers but of defiance. And though the defenders vastly outnumbered them, panic began to spread among the enemy ranks because they faced not weary men stumbling at the edge of collapse but warriors who fought as if already immortal. Smoke curled upward in thick black columns, blotting out the stars, the air alive with sparks and embers, and amidst it all she moved like a blade through water, cutting swift and clean, her presence steadying the men even as the chaos threatened to swallow them whole. Bullets cracked past their ears, grenades shook the ground, shouts and foreign tongues clashed with cries of pain, and yet the squad pressed on, weaving deeper into the encampment, striking supply piles to set them ablaze, tearing down communications equipment, scattering the carefully laid order of their foes into ruin. She directed them with sharp gestures, each one clear, decisive, never hesitating even when the enemy surged from every side. At one point they found themselves pinned against a half-collapsed bunker, machine gun fire tearing through the walls, and fear surged again in the men as the gun roared unceasing. She did not waste time shouting. She crawled through the rubble under the hail of bullets, disappearing into smoke, and seconds later the gun went silent, replaced by a scream cut short. When she emerged, her rifle dark with soot, the men surged forward again with renewed fire in their blood, shoving deeper into the heart of the camp. The battle stretched on into madness, seconds blending into minutes, minutes into eternities, the squad burning through ammunition until every shot had to count, every trigger squeeze measured, but still they did not yield. She seemed tireless, though her body bore wounds now, a gash along her arm, blood soaking through torn fabric at her side, yet her steps did not falter, and so theirs did not either. Even the injured soldier who had stumbled since the kill zone found the strength to fight on, his pain drowned beneath the conviction that if she could still walk, still fight, then he would not stop until he no longer drew breath. They pushed into the command sector of the camp, where larger tents rose, sturdier and guarded more fiercely, and the enemy threw everything at them to stop their advance. Mortar shells rained down, sending earth and fire skyward, machine guns chattered from hastily fortified nests, waves of infantry charged with desperate cries. But the squad fought like a tide, ebbing and flowing yet never receding, their unity sharpened into a single spearhead by her will. She led the charge into the largest tent, bursting through its flaps with rifle blazing, and inside they found the enemy officers scrambling, maps spread across tables, orders half-shouted. The slaughter was swift, merciless, and when it was done she lit the maps aflame with a lighter she pulled from her pocket, watching as the flames devoured the enemy's plans. Outside the camp burned, the defenders scattering in disarray, some fleeing into the night, others throwing down their weapons in surrender. But there were still those who fought, clinging to their positions with fanatic determination, and the battle raged on. The squad was exhausted beyond comprehension now, their limbs heavy, their vision blurring, their wounds screaming, but the fire inside them still burned, carried from the moment she had first stepped into the kill zone and never allowed to die. They fought with that memory at their core, the knowledge that they were not here by accident but by choice, by the choice she had shown them was possible. And when the last line of resistance collapsed, when the final gunshots faded into silence, when the smoke began to clear and the camp was nothing more than ruins and fire, the squad stood together, broken but unbroken. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, their uniforms soaked in blood and sweat, their weapons heavy in their hands, but they were alive. And they had won. The enemy camp, the fortress that had seemed insurmountable, lay shattered at their feet, its defenders slain or scattered, its supplies burning, its commands silenced. The men looked at one another, disbelief mingled with triumph, the weight of what they had done settling in their bones. And then their eyes turned to her. She stood at the center of them, swaying slightly from exhaustion, her face pale with blood loss, but her gaze steady, unbroken, the fire still burning there even as her body threatened to collapse. She had led them through it all, from the edge of paralysis at the kill zone to the heart of the enemy's fortress, and because of her they had survived, they had prevailed. No one spoke at first, the silence filled only by the crackle of flames and the distant cries of the fleeing. Then one man, voice hoarse, whispered the truth they all felt: "We would have died there without you." She shook her head, denying it, but they all knew it was true. They had been frozen, paralyzed by fear, until she had taken the first step, and every victory since had been carved from that single act of defiance. She did not claim the glory, she did not stand tall and demand recognition, she only nodded once, then sank onto a piece of broken timber to catch her breath, her rifle across her knees, her eyes scanning the horizon as if already preparing for what might come next. The men gathered around her, forming a circle not by command but by instinct, guarding her as she had guarded them, silent vows etched in every glance. The night was not yet over and the war was far from finished, but they knew that whatever came they would face it together, bound by something deeper than orders, deeper than duty. They had walked into death's jaws and returned, and they would never be the same again. The memory of the kill zone would never leave them, the memory of paralysis and shame, but it would never haunt them either because it had been broken. She had broken it with one step, and because of that step they had discovered what they were truly capable of. They looked at her not as a comrade anymore but as the heart of their survival, the embodiment of the courage they had found within themselves. She did not ask for it, she did not want it, but it was hers all the same. And in the firelight of the burning camp, amidst the wreckage of battle and the silence that followed, the squad understood that this night would live in them forever, not as a nightmare but as a testament to the truth that courage, once born, could never be extinguished. Dawn began to creep over the horizon, faint streaks of gray and silver cutting through the smoke-filled sky, and as the first light touched the ruined camp the squad saw with weary eyes the scale of what they had endured. The hilltop that hours earlier had seemed impregnable was now nothing more than smoldering wreckage, its defenses shattered, its soldiers defeated, its commands silenced. Yet the men who had taken it were scarcely more than shadows of themselves, bent under exhaustion, bandaged with scraps of cloth, bloodied and bruised but still standing and still alive. They had no illusions about what they had done. It had not been glory or triumph that carried them, but the stubborn refusal to bow when fear demanded submission. And at the center of that refusal stood her, the woman who had taken the first step when all of them had crouched paralyzed at the kill zone. She had not slept, had not faltered, and though her body showed every sign of wear, her eyes burned as fiercely in the pale light of morning as they had in the blackness of night. The squad gathered what supplies they could from the ruins, scavenging ammunition, food and medical kits, patching their wounds as best as they could. They worked in silence, each man locked in the private battlefield of his own thoughts, remembering the moments when he had nearly broken, the moments when death had seemed certain, the moments when he had looked to her and found the strength to take another step. The injured soldier she had carried through the firefight lay propped against a burned-out crate, his face pale but his eyes clear, watching her with a gratitude so deep it needed no words. Around him, the others moved with a strange calm, not the frantic pace of soldiers still afraid but the steady resolve of men who had already met their fear and walked through it. Yet peace was not theirs to keep, not yet. As the sun rose higher, scouts reported enemy movement beyond the ridge, remnants of the force regrouping, perhaps reinforcements approaching, perhaps a counterattack preparing. The squad knew they could not hold the camp indefinitely. Their mission had been to strike, to cripple, and now it was done. But escape was not guaranteed. The kill zone still waited behind them, the forest still crawled with danger, and the enemy was not yet finished. They looked to her again, not with desperation this time but with trust, because she had carried them this far and they believed she would carry them further still. She studied the horizon for a long moment, then rose to her feet despite the blood seeping from her side, slinging her rifle across her back and adjusting her gear. Her movements were slow, heavy with fatigue, but steady, and in that steadiness the men found their orders without her needing to speak. They prepared to move, packing what little they could carry, readying themselves for another march through fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but firm. "We leave now." The words cut through the haze of exhaustion like a blade. There was no protest, no hesitation. They fell into formation behind her, the same formation that had carried them through every peril of the night, and together they began their descent from the burning camp. The forest below awaited, silent and ominous, but they entered it without the same dread as before, because they had already proven to themselves that fear could be mastered. Each man walked not just for himself but for the others, bound in unity, carrying one another with invisible strength. She led them down the ridge, her pace steady, her senses sharp despite the blood that still stained her uniform, and though the forest whispered again with unseen threats, the men did not falter. They knew danger would come, but they also knew they would face it together, and that knowledge was enough. Hours stretched as they moved through the dense trees, each step an effort, each breath a reminder of wounds and fatigue, but the silence of pursuit made their hope grow. Perhaps they had struck deeply enough that the enemy was in too much chaos to follow. Perhaps they had bought themselves the chance to escape. Yet just as that hope began to solidify, the crack of gunfire shattered it. Bullets tore through the trees, splinters flying, and the squad dove for cover as shouts rose all around them. The enemy had not given up after all. They had regrouped and they had been waiting. The squad returned fire, rifles flashing, grenades bursting, the forest erupting into chaos once more. Men shouted warnings, cried out in pain, called for ammunition, but through it all her voice carried above the noise, calm and sharp, directing their fire, moving them into better positions. She fought not from behind but from the front, weaving through the trees, her rifle cracking with precision, her courage unbroken. The squad rallied around her as they always had, their exhaustion burned away in the furnace of survival, their fear transformed into the fury of men who refused to be broken. The battle stretched long, the enemy pressing from every side, but the squad fought like wolves, coordinated, relentless, refusing to give ground. Bodies fell, smoke thickened, blood stained the earth, and still they held. When finally the last of the attackers broke and fled into the forest, silence returned, heavy and suffocating. The squad counted their numbers, bandaged their wounded, and realized with grim relief that though they were diminished, they were not destroyed. She stood among them, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, her body trembling with fatigue but still upright, still leading. She looked at each of them in turn, her gaze steady, and though she said nothing, the message was clear. They would keep moving until they were safe. The men nodded, shouldering their packs, lifting their weapons, tightening their grips on one another. And together once more they followed her into the forest, not because orders demanded it, not because survival was certain, but because they believed. They had believed from the moment she had taken the first step into the kill zone, and that belief was now etched into their very souls, unshakable, eternal. The forest stretched endlessly before them, a maze of trees and shadows where danger could lurk behind every trunk, but as the squad pressed forward, step after step, hour after grueling hour, there was no longer the same paralyzing dread that had once held them captive at the kill zone. Their bodies were battered, their wounds raw, their breath ragged, yet their spirit burned hotter than the pain, a fire that had been lit the moment she had taken that first impossible step and carried them all with her. Each man moved now with a grim determination that no enemy could extinguish, for they had crossed the line between fear and courage, and there was no going back. The trees whispered with the sound of wind, branches creaked, distant gunfire echoed faintly somewhere far away, but the squad kept their formation tight, weapons at the ready, eyes scanning the undergrowth. She walked at the front, her posture straight despite the exhaustion clawing at her bones, her rifle slung low but her gaze sharp, her presence a beacon that held the men together. Every time they faltered, every time fatigue tempted them to collapse, they looked at her and found the strength to keep moving, and in this way the march itself became a battle, a final test of endurance and will. When at last the forest began to thin, when the heavy canopy gave way to patches of sky and the ground sloped gently downward, they knew they were nearing the river, the one place where extraction might still be possible. The thought of safety sparked through them like lightning, but they did not allow themselves to celebrate too soon. They knew well enough by now that hope was always met with another trial. And sure enough, as the rushing sound of water reached their ears and the trees opened to reveal the wide ribbon of the river, they saw shapes moving on the opposite bank. Enemy patrols, armed and waiting, their silhouettes clear in the morning light. The squad froze, the old paralysis threatening to return, for the river was open ground, no cover, no place to hide. To cross meant exposure, meant risking death all over again. For a heartbeat the memory of the kill zone came rushing back, the bullets, the fear, the certainty of doom. But then they remembered who they were now, what they had become. They looked to her, waiting, trusting. She studied the river, the patrols, the terrain, calculating in silence, her jaw set, her eyes hard. She knew what was at stake. One wrong move and everything they had fought for, everything they had survived would be wasted. At last she turned to them, her voice quiet but resolute. "We cross together. Fast. Don't stop." There was no argument. No hesitation. They tightened their grips on their weapons, adjusted their packs, steadied themselves. She stepped forward first as she always had, and without another word she plunged into the river, the cold water rising around her as the current pulled at her legs. The squad followed instantly, splashing into the current, struggling to keep their footing as the water surged around them. Shouts rang out from the opposite bank as the enemy patrol spotted them, rifles raised, gunfire cracking across the river. Bullets punched into the water, sending up sprays, tearing through waves, but the squad pressed on, half swimming, half stumbling, dragging one another forward. She was at the front, pushing through the current with relentless determination, her body a silhouette of defiance against the storm of gunfire. One man stumbled, slipping beneath the water, but she grabbed his arm and hauled him up, never slowing, never faltering. The enemy fire intensified, the air alive with the hiss of bullets, but the squad fought the river with the same fury they had fought the camp, every stroke a refusal to yield. And then, as their feet touched the shallows of the far bank, as their hands clawed at the mud to pull themselves up, the enemy charged. The patrol surged forward with bayonets and rifles, shouting as they sought to drive the intruders back into the water. But the squad, though drenched and weary, rose from the river like men reborn, their weapons blazing, their voices rising in a roar that drowned out everything else. The clash was brutal, hand to hand, blade against rifle, fist against flesh, but the squad fought with the strength of men who had nothing left to lose, only everything to protect. She was at the center, her rifle an extension of her will, striking with deadly precision, every movement sharp and unyielding. Around her the men mirrored her ferocity, their formation unbreakable even amidst the chaos. The riverbank became a slaughter ground, screams mingling with the rush of water, bodies falling into the current, blood staining the shallows, but still the squad pushed forward, driving the enemy back step by step until at last the survivors broke and fled into the trees, their courage shattered. Silence fell again, broken only by the rush of the river. The squad stood trembling, their chests heaving, their wounds bleeding freely, but their eyes burned with the fire of survival. They had crossed. Against all odds, against every trial, they had crossed. Beyond the trees, faint at first but growing stronger, came the sound of engines, the low rumble of approaching vehicles. And then they saw them, friendly transports rolling toward the riverbank, the promise of safety at last. Relief swept through the squad, so strong it nearly knocked them from their feet. For the first time since stepping into the kill zone, true safety was within reach. Yet even in that moment, even as salvation approached, their eyes turned not to the vehicles but to her. She stood at the water's edge, her body swaying with exhaustion, her uniform soaked, her wounds deep, but her head held high, her gaze steady. She had carried them all this way, step by step, battle by battle, fear by fear, and because of her they had survived what should have been impossible. They moved toward her, gathering around her as they had so many times before, silent in their gratitude, their respect, their unspoken vow. She looked at each of them, and though she said nothing, the weight of her gaze was enough. They had been broken men once, paralyzed by fear, trapped at the edge of death, but she had shown them another path. She had taken the first step when no one else could, and in doing so had awakened the courage they never knew they possessed. Now, as the transports waited, as the war beyond called them to new battles, they knew that whatever came, they would face it together. For they were no longer just a squad of soldiers. They were survivors of the kill zone, bound forever by the fire of that night and the woman who had led them through it. And as they climbed into the transports, battered but unbroken, they carried with them not just the memory of fear but the truth that courage, once born, can never die. The end.